It was late September, and the heat enveloped the city with that typical suffocating weight of afternoons, when everything seems even more exhausting. Valentina always arrived 15 minutes before her shift began, even if no one noticed. She had been working for almost 2 years at the Avenida Central branch, one of the busiest in the Castillo chain of stores, yet her name was rarely remembered. At 26, she carried more than just tasks. She bore a weariness in her body that came not only from the hours spent on her feet, but from a lifetime of trying not to bother, not to take up space, not to be seen. Shy, with a soft voice and eyes that avoided confrontation, she had gotten used to fitting into the corners, to becoming part of the room's furniture. Her presence was as constant as it was unnoticed. The store was both her refuge and her prison. It was the one place where she knew exactly what to do, even if that meant being treated with indifference, or worse, with contempt. That specific day, Valentina had organized the cosmetics section with the zeal of someone trying, at the very least, to make something look beautiful when the rest of life was in disarray. She was bent over, aligning the last rows of lipsticks, when she heard the dry, hurried footsteps of the manager, Javier. The sound of his shoes on the ceramic floor was enough to make her body stiffen, as if her muscles memorized the fear even before her mind could process the danger. Javier was the type who shouted to feel in control and made sure to use Valentina as his verbal punching bag. At that moment, without any apparent reason, he approached and unleashed a cruel comment about her slowness, mixing irony and sarcasm with an unnecessary dose of humiliation. Again, with that snail's pace, even an old man with a cane would do it faster. Do you want me to draw a diagram on how to organize a shelf? The mocking laughter that followed echoed down the corridors. Valentina remained silent, as she always did. But there was someone that day who did not remain so. What Valentina did not know, and would only realize seconds later, was that at that very moment, someone was watching her. At the end of the side corridor, standing beside the display of imported fragrances, was Andrés Castillo, the owner of the chain, the man who until then had been just a distant image in internal communications or in the corporate portraits pinned in the administrative office. He had stopped by the store for an unexpected visit, one of those unannounced except for the highest-ranking positions. He was wearing a dark grey blazer over an impeccable white shirt, without a tie, with the cuffs slightly rolled up, and an expression that scanned the environment effortlessly, but with surgical precision. His eyes, however, were not focused on sales or product displays. They were fixed on the absurd scene he had just witnessed. For a few seconds, he did not move. He simply observed Valentina's reaction, or rather the lack thereof. That submissive, silent posture, almost trained not to react, clashed head-on with something he couldn't quite explain, but that disturbed him deeply. Perhaps because in a world where everything was performance, that silence hurt more than any shout. Andrés walked over to where they were. The sound of his shoes on the floor was different, confident, rhythmic, firm. Javier turned at the sound of his approach and, with a mix of surprise and embarrassment, tried to cover it up with a forced smile. "Ah, Mr. Castillo, we didn't know you were visiting today. We were just adjusting the organization here." His pathetic attempt to smooth over the scene shattered like glass on the floor. Andrés did not answer immediately. He looked at Valentina, who was still crouched, holding a lipstick in her hand, as if it were a fragile shield. Then he turned to Javier, now with a calm but cutting tone. "You're fired. Effective immediately." The ensuing silence was dense, almost palpable. The colleagues stopped what they were doing. Some customers discreetly glanced over the shelves. Javier stood frozen, as if he had misheard. But Andrés simply repeated with a serenity that was alarming, "Fired. For verbal abuse and unacceptable conduct towards an employee. Collect your things." Valentina did not know what to do. She was still crouched, the lipstick still clutched between her fingers, as if the world had frozen for an instant. She only raised her eyes when she realized that everyone was looking at her, but not in that usual cruel, judgmental way. There was something different in the looks, a disconcerting curiosity, a mix of surprise and discomfort. For the first time, she was not invisible. For the first time, she was the center of a scene, and that made her want to disappear. Her hands trembled slightly, and she tried to hide it by putting the product back on the shelf, as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. Her body knew, even if her mind had yet to catch up. It was as if an inner foundation had been shaken. Humiliation had become routine, but someone intervening, someone saying out loud that it was wrong, that wasn't part of her life script. Andres continued watching her, and that made her even more uneasy. There was no judgment in his look, nor pity. There was something else there. Perhaps a silent attempt to understand who that woman was, who even after being defended, still seemed smaller than she really was. He said no more. He simply motioned for one of the supervisors to come over and instructed him to formalize Javier's termination. Before leaving the store, he turned his gaze back to Valentina and, with a slight nod, departed. It was a subtle gesture, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying attention, but it had an unexpected effect on her. For the rest of the afternoon, she couldn't concentrate. Thoughts came in confusing waves: gratitude, shame, relief, fear, doubt. Why did he do that? What did it mean? Why her, of all people? When she got home that day, Valentina took off her shoes at the door, as she always did, but she noticed that her movements were slower, almost disconnected from her body. The apartment was small, quiet, and tidy, the kind of space that didn't reveal anything about its inhabitants. On the table rested the same chipped cup she used every morning, the same half-empty cookie jar, the same feeling of repetition. But that night, there was something strange hanging in the air, a discomfort that did not come from outside, but from within. She sat on the sofa without turning on the light, only with the street's brightness streaming in through the window. She felt misplaced within her own life, as if she had returned to a setting that no longer suited her. She tried to distract herself by watching something on television, but everything felt distant, meaningless. The episode at the store played in her mind like a silent film. Every word from Javier, every gesture from Andres, every look she received afterwards. It was as if, for a brief moment, they had pulled back the curtain that always obscured her, and now she didn't know what to do with the light that had come in. She remembered her childhood, of when she tried to show the drawings she made at school, and her mother only replied with a "I'll see it later," which never happened. She remembered her father, who disappeared when she still wore braids, and believed that everyone had a safe place to return to. She remembered the times she tried to speak, but no one listened. The feeling that now dominated her was a dangerous mix. It wasn't exactly sadness, nor happiness. It was the unease of someone who, for the first time, had a glimpse of what could be different. And that scared her more than any shout, because if someone had defended her, then perhaps, maybe she really didn't deserve to be treated the way she always was. And that maybe was the kind of thought that turned everything upside down. Inside, the next morning, Valentina woke up before the alarm, as if her body was in a hurry to resume the routine, but her mind was still behind. She took a shower in silence, put on her usual uniform, the light blue shirt with the store's logo embroidered on the chest, and tied her hair in a simple bun, as she did every day. But when she looked in the mirror before leaving, something bothered her. It was the same reflection, the same features, but it seemed that her eyes were different. There was a tension there, a confused gleam, as if an unspoken question was being asked from within, without her knowing how to answer. On the way to work, she noticed things that had previously gone unnoticed. The smell of the corner bakery, the man sweeping the sidewalk with his radio blaring, the group of teenagers at the bus stop laughing at some inside joke. It was as if suddenly everything was clearer, and that only made it more evident how blurred her own life seemed. When she entered the store, she felt the stares again, They weren't malicious or intrusive, but there was a kind of silence that opened up every time she passed, as if everyone was waiting for a reaction that never came. The supervisor greeted her with a timid nod and quickly looked away, as if he still wasn't sure how to deal with what had happened. Valentina went straight to the cosmetic section and began organizing the shelves as she did every day, trying to cling to the familiarity of routine. But everything felt strange. Javier's absence created an uncomfortable void, as if a piece were missing, even if that piece had been the very weight that had crushed her. It was like relearning how to walk on a floor that suddenly felt lighter. And that relief, rather than comforting her, made her suspicious. She didn't know how to exist without that weight. She didn't know what to do with the space that was left. At lunch, Valentina sat by herself, as she always did. She chose the table at the back, in the cafeteria, the same one every day, where she could eat in silence without having to engage in empty conversations. But this time, she couldn't keep her focus on the food. The fork trembled slightly in her hand, and the cold rice seemed harder to swallow than usual. Javier's words still echoed, but more than that, it was Andres's gesture that occupied too much space in her thoughts. It made no sense. Why would someone like him, a man who lived in another universe, who probably didn't even know her, name until that day, be bothered by that? What did he see in her that the others had never noticed? It was disconcerting to think about. It stirred things within her that she preferred to keep locked away. It had been years since she allowed herself to think about being noticed. Being invisible was her safety zone, her way of surviving. Being seen required courage, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for that. Then something even more unexpected happened. When she returned to her section, she found an administrative employee holding a white envelope. "Valentina, they left this for you," the woman said, before quickly walking away. Her heart raced for no apparent reason. The envelope was plain, with no external identification. When she opened it, she found a handwritten note with firm handwriting. "I would like to speak with you tomorrow at 9 a.m. at the administrative headquarters, AC." For a few seconds, she froze, trying to process it. The AC was unmistakable. Andres Castillo. Her mind raced in different directions all at once. She was being summoned by him. But why? Had she done something wrong? Would it be a disguised reprimand, or was it something bigger? The idea put her on high alert and scared, very scared. That night, Valentina couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in bed, with Andres's note resting on the nightstand as if it had physical weight, as if it emitted some kind of vibration that wouldn't let her be at peace. She tried to imagine what he might want to discuss. Was it just a formality, a polite conversation to close the chapter on the previous day? Or did he expect something from her that she still didn't know how to offer? Her mind scrambled everything, mixing old memories with future possibilities. It was as if a portal had opened before her, but she still had her feet stuck on the same old ground. At some point in the early hours, she sat up on the bed and remained there, staring into nothingness, feeling her heart beating faster than normal. For the first time in a long while, she was being called to something she didn't understand, and that didn't fill her with excitement. It made her uneasy, suspicious, vulnerable. She didn't know how to handle invitations. She was used only to orders. The next morning, she put on the only dress shirt she had, a worn piece stored at the back of her closet, bought years ago for a job interview that went nowhere. She carefully ironed the fabric, fixed her hair with extra attention, and chose a pair of small, discreet earrings, almost invisible, as she used to be. On the way to the administrative headquarters, she felt like a child entering an adult's room. The building was another world, mirrored, imposing, silent, the kind of place she thought she would never have any reason to be. When she arrived at reception, she announced her name in a trembling voice. The receptionist smiled and said, "He's already waiting for you." Valentina swallowed hard. She took the elevator up to the 12th floor, feeling her legs grow heavier with every second. Upon entering the meeting room, she found Andres waiting for her. He was seated, leafing through some papers, but he stood up as soon as he saw her, and, for the second time in 2 days, she felt that someone was truly looking at her and not just glancing over. "Thank you for coming, Valentina." Andres's voice was firm, yet not arrogant. It had that direct tone of someone used to leading, but at the same time, curiously, he seemed to make an effort not to appear intimidating. Valentina only nodded, unsure whether she should sit, speak, or just wait. He pointed to the chair in front of her and waited for her to settle. For a few seconds, there was an odd silence, and she noticed that he was looking at her in a different way, not with superficial interest, but with a sort of analytical curiosity, as if he wanted to understand what lay behind that withdrawn posture, that soft voice, that ever-alert gaze. "I don't usually interfere in the operational matters of the stores," he began, "but what I saw yesterday disturbed me, not because of a failure in service, but because no one should be treated that way, and you stayed silent, as if that were normal." Valentina felt her face warm up. She didn't know how to respond, because in fact it was normal, or at least it had always been. Andres then leaned slightly forward, resting his elbows on the table, and changed the tone of the conversation. "I wanted to propose something to you," he said. "We have an internal project in its initial phase, a kind of training laboratory aimed at identifying hidden talents among the entry-level employees, people who, like you, perhaps never had a real opportunity to grow." Valentina stared at him, confused. This seemed like a mistake, a misunderstanding. Her talent? Her part of a special project? It was even hard to imagine. Andres continued, "I know this must seem strange, but I want you to participate. It will be outside the store with direct supervision from leaders and structured training. It's not a promotion, it's a reconstruction." Those words hung in the air. Reconstruction. She didn't know if she felt gratitude, fear, or distrust, but she knew for sure that nothing in her life had ever been called that before. It took her a few seconds to muster any reaction. The idea seemed so far removed from her reality that for a moment she thought it must be some kind of test or corporate prank. She felt her body stiffen in the chair, as if she didn't belong in that environment. Her mind whirled, trying to find a reason to refuse even before she fully understood what it represented. "But why me?" she asked, her voice lower than she intended. Andres rested his chin on his hand and answered calmly, "Because I saw someone there who deserves more than what they are living, and because perhaps it's time for you to see yourself that way too." The answer sounded simple, almost obvious, but inside her it reverberated like thunder. No one had ever spoken to her that way before, firmly and respectfully at the same time, without empty promises, without a tone of superiority. Just an invitation. An invitation that paradoxically seemed more frightening than staying where she always had been. She left the meeting as if she had just crossed a minefield. She walked along the sidewalks without noticing where she was going, with tense shoulders and eyes full of tears. She wasn't crying out of sadness. She was crying out of confusion, because when someone opens a door you didn't even know existed, everything around you changes perspective. The city seemed noisier, the people more hurried, and she even more out of place. When she got home, she dropped her purse on the sofa and stood in the middle of the room for long minutes. She thought of everything that could go wrong. She thought that maybe she wasn't smart enough, strong enough, prepared enough. She thought that if she accepted that proposal and failed, everything would get worse. But she also thought, and that was the most dangerous thought of all, that maybe it was indeed time to try, and that, for the first time, didn't seem completely absurd. The next morning, Valentina woke up determined to give an answer. She still didn't know whether it would be yes or no, but she knew she had to leave that limbo. She had spent the night trying to convince herself that the invitation wasn't meant for her, that perhaps they had mistaken or exaggerated in their perception. But something insisted within her, a disconcerting, almost painful curiosity about what would happen if she accepted. She caught an earlier metro, her fingers gripping the handle of her purse tightly, as if that could contain the whirlwind of thoughts. When she arrived at the headquarters, she was taken to a small room where Andres was waiting. He greeted her with the same naturalness as the day before, as if such meetings were routine, as if she already belonged to that world. "You don't have to decide now," he said even before she could say anything. "But if you want to try, the program starts next week. You just need to say yes." Valentina took a deep breath. She thought of the years of invisibility, the times she had swallowed humiliations in silence, the echo of Javier's words, the silence of colleagues who never intervened. And without overthinking, she answered, "I accept." The words came out softly, almost hesitantly, but they were out. And in that moment, something shifted within her. It wasn't an explosion of confidence, nor a cinematic turnaround. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but one weighted with decision. Andres only nodded with a slight smile and handed her the first reading materials for the project. It was a notebook with basic guidelines, a folder with information about the training sessions, and an agenda with dates and times. Valentina took everything with some apprehension, as if holding something she still couldn't believe was hers. On her way home, she carried a purse full of papers, but for the first time in a long while, she felt she was carrying something that could really change her life. And that terrified her, because now the next step depended solely on her. In the first week of the program, Valentina felt like a foreigner in a country with no translation. The training room was spacious, air-conditioned, with white walls and cold lighting. The chairs were too comfortable, the coffee was always fresh, and all the materials were organized in personalized folders with the participants' names. It seemed like something from another world for someone who came from the store's floor. The other members of the group, about 10 people, came from different branches of the chain, and although they also held entry-level positions, they seemed much more relaxed, more confident, more adaptable. Valentina kept to the corner, noting everything meticulously, but speaking little. She still felt out of place, as if she were about to be unmasked at any moment. There was a constant fear of making a mistake, of asking a silly question, of drawing attention inappropriately. And yet, in the midst of it all, there was a small spark within her, almost imperceptible, that made her keep coming back every day. The content was dense: leadership, assertive communication, organizational behavior, emotional intelligence, words that seemed too big to fit inside her. But little by little she began to realize that she understood more than she imagined, not because she was naturally brilliant, but because she paid attention to every detail, because she carried a silent baggage that theory did not teach. In one of the first group activities, she was praised for the way she articulated a practical solution to a customer service problem. The instructor commented that her reading of the customer's behavior was precise and intuitive. That left her bewildered. She wasn't used to being publicly complimented. She blushed, looked away, but couldn't help a small smile that escaped without permission. For the first time, she felt something like pride. A timid, contained, but genuine pride. And that, for someone who had spent her life being reduced to the minimum, was nothing short of a revolution. As the weeks passed, Valentina began to become a figure observed, not for being withdrawn, but because, without realizing it, she was standing out. She was meticulous, punctual, committed to every task. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her words were spot on. There was a simple, direct clarity in her observations, something that contrasted with the rehearsed speech of some colleagues who tried to impress with fancy words. Not her. She was objective, practical, and above all, coherent. That caught the attention of the project mentors. They began to ask for her opinion more frequently, to trust specific tasks to her, and the more responsibilities she received, the more she felt that she was entering a new territory, fascinating but also frightening. At night, at home, she would look at her own notes and hardly believe they were hers. There remained a part of her that expected to be pulled out of that place at any moment, as if everything were provisional, a fleeting stroke of luck that would soon run out. But along with the recognition came the first internal conflicts. She began to feel different from the people she had always known. She realized that when she talked with former colleagues from the store, their conversations no longer fit as they once did. The topics seemed shallow, the tone of the conversations discordant, and the silence between phrases began to grow. It was as if she were changing inside, and instead of being liberating, it made her feel guilty. At times, she wondered if she was betraying her origins, if she was becoming arrogant by starting to occupy spaces she had never even imagined before. She still feared, appearing to be someone she was not. She missed the simplicity, the safe anonymity that had protected her, but there was also a part of her, small yet growing, that began to enjoy the feeling of having a voice, of being someone people listened to, and that confused her more than any of the training content. It was during an integration lunch that Valentina realized how much she was adapting to the new world and how that left her divided. Everyone was gathered in a restaurant near the headquarters, celebrating the completion of the first module of the program. The table was long, noisy, filled with laughter and comments about goals, indicators, and career strategies. She tried to keep up, participated in some conversations, even laughed at jokes she didn't find particularly funny, but at one point she caught herself observing her own behavior, as if watching herself from the outside. She noticed that she was sitting straighter, more confidently when speaking, that her words came out with more firmness, and that others listened to her attentively. That which should have been a source of pride generated an unexpected discomfort in her. She couldn't help but think, who is this version of me that is here now, and what happened to the one from before? That night, when she got home, she sat on the floor of the living room, surrounded by the program's materials, and cried in silence. It was a strange cry, without any specific reason, but layered with emotion. It wasn't sadness, nor joy. It was a confused pain, as if she felt she was gaining something and losing something else at the same time. She missed the old Valentina, even though she knew that that version was also the result of pains she no longer wanted to live. It was as if she was saying goodbye to the only identity she had known, without yet knowing what would come in its place. The fear of change wasn't about the new, it was about the void between what was and what is not yet. A space where nothing seems solid, where everything appears to be in transition, and in that void, all she could do was continue, even without fully understanding what she was becoming. It wasn't long after that silent night that the truth arrived like a cold blade, sharp, dry, unexpected. Valentina was in the office for a final project presentation, a symbolic event that would close that phase of the program. She was nervous but composed. She had rehearsed, reviewed the data, and prepared slides with care. At the end of the presentation, she was called into a private conversation with one of the program coordinators, a woman named Elisa, known for being direct and to the point. At first, Valentina thought it would be just feedback, but the conversation took another turn. Elisa, perhaps out of overconfidence or thinking that Valentina was already sufficiently integrated, let slip a piece of information that made her freeze. Andres mentioned that it was interesting to see how someone with your profile would react in this type of environment. He wanted to test the reach of the proposal. The phrase echoed like an unbearable buzz. Test, profile, react, experiment. Suddenly everything lost its color. Valentina left the room with cold hands and a dry throat. She walked down the corridor, barely seeing, with the sounds around her muffled, as if she had plunged underwater. An experiment. She was part of a test. That opportunity, which had seemed like a rare chance for change, now took on a different hue. Somber, manipulative, almost cruel. She felt used, as if she had been dragged into that new world not by merit but by someone else's curiosity. It wasn't about recognizing her potential, it was about seeing if she would survive. The pain she felt was deep, but different from before. It wasn't the pain of humiliation, it was the pain of clarity. A disappointment that didn't come from someone who mistreated her, but from someone who pulled her out of the shadows, and even then treated her as an object of observation, and that hurt her in a place she didn't even know existed. The next day, Valentina went to the headquarters unannounced. She entered with firm steps, not even noticing the apprehension of the receptionists as they saw her with that hard, focused look, different from her usual demeanor. She went straight to the executive floor. She knocked on Andres's office door harder than she intended. He looked up, surprised, and before he could say anything, she had already entered. She did not ask for permission. She did not apologize. For the first time, she would speak without fear of seeming disrespectful. "You chose me as a test," she blurted out, without preamble. Andres appeared taken aback. He tried to maintain his composure, but his expression changed. "Valentina, it's not exactly like that," he began, but she interrupted him. "Don't treat me like a child. I heard you wanted to see if someone like me could survive here, not because you saw potential, but because you wanted to. Observe the process, like throwing a stone into a lake just to see the ripples." Her voice did not tremble, and that was new. Andres took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Yes, the proposal did start like that. I wanted to understand if this project was viable with profiles that usually don't have access to this kind of training. But what you have built so far has nothing to do with an experiment. You exceeded every expectation. You became more than the test itself." Valentina remained silent for a few seconds. Then she spoke with a cutting calm. "The problem isn't that you started as an experiment. It's that you didn't tell me. It's that you put me in that position without giving me the chance to choose consciously. I deserve to know, because now everything I've achieved seems tainted." She didn't shout. She didn't cry. But her presence was stronger than any emotional explosion. Andres realized it, and for the first time he seemed truly small before her. In the following days, Valentina disappeared. She no longer appeared at the project meetings, didn't answer emails, and ignored phone calls. She needed to breathe. She needed to find her own center again before making any decision. She spent hours walking around the city, sitting in parks, watching people, trying to understand what she really felt. The anger had subsided, but the weight of disappointment still remained. Deep down, it wasn't just about Andres. It was about everything she had carried. It was about every moment when she believed she wasn't enough, about every time she settled for emotional crumbs. The project had been a spark, but now she knew that the flame was hers, not anyone else's. For the first time, she realized that perhaps she no longer needed someone to open doors for her. Maybe she had already learned how to open her own, and that realization hurt, but it also set her free. When she finally returned, she didn't apologize for her absence. She entered the room with calm. Steps sat in her usual spot and resumed her studies as if nothing had happened, but everyone knew that something had changed. Her posture was different. Firmer, more direct, more aware, and most importantly, more demanding. She began to question more during the training sessions, to propose changes in the content, to insist that her colleagues also have a real opportunity to speak instead of merely memorizing pretty phrases. She no longer accepted the role of a passive apprentice. She wanted to be an active player. If before she felt like she was trying to fit in, now she wanted to transform the space around her. Andres noticed this change quickly. He tried to get closer again, but she was clear. She did not want personal bonds. She didn't want to be protected nor guided. She wanted equality and power. If she were to continue there, it would be with autonomy. And he understood, because now who set the terms was her. Time passed, and what was once merely an experimental project became a structural part of the company. Not only did Valentina complete the program, but she was also invited to join the talent development team, now as a trainer. It was surreal to think that just a few months earlier, she was only another invisible name among the many badges at the Avenida Central store. Now, she conducted workshops, created content, and led training sessions. More than that, she was listened to, respected, consulted on important decisions. She still carried her shyness in certain gestures, but she had acquired a new kind of presence, silent yet firm. Her name began circulating in the corridors with a different weight. Some called her the program's surprise, others the discreet reference. But for her, none of that mattered as much as the simple fact of finally being able to look in the mirror and recognize who she was. Even with all these achievements, Valentina knew that her transformation wasn't just about the position. It was something deeper. It wasn't about climbing the hierarchy, but about breaking the logic of submission that had shaped her entire life. And ironically, the higher she rose, the more she had to protect herself from the risk of losing her essence. Sometimes she found herself reproducing behaviors she had always criticized, being too demanding, impatient, distant, and that scared her. She started writing down small reflections every night, so as not to forget where she came from, how she got there. It was her way of keeping her feet on the ground. She knew that power without consciousness becomes arrogance, and she did not want to become the kind of person who once made her feel afraid. The strength she now carried needed to serve to build, not to crush, and that was the pact she made with herself every day. Even with all that maturity, there were days when Valentina felt tired of herself. It wasn't physical exhaustion, but emotional, a fatigue born from constantly watching over who she was becoming. In the corporate environment, everything seemed to demand more focus, more commitment, more firmness. And the more she grew, the more she felt that there was no space for vulnerabilities. She began to wonder if she necessarily needed to be tough all the time to continue being respected. Sometimes she wished she could simply let her guard down without being seen as weak. But deep inside, she knew that the system she now worked in rewarded masks, and she refused to wear one. So she decided to do things differently. She started voicing her doubts in meetings, admitting when she didn't know something, and giving space for true listening. At first, people found it odd. Then they came to admire it. This choice had consequences. Valentina began to inspire other employees who, like her, came from silent stories. People who until then had learned to survive in silence started to seek a voice. It was as if her journey cracked the invisible ceiling that existed over so many ordinary people. But at the same time, she knew that this put her in a lonely position. She no longer belonged to her original group, nor was she entirely part of the new circle. She was a point between worlds, and sometimes she missed belonging. But she had learned that true belonging is not built in places that demand you diminish yourself. And if she had to walk alone for a while, so be it. She preferred the solitude of integrity to the comfort of submission. And that certainty, even if painful on some days, was what sustained every step she took from that point on. It was during an internal company seminar that Valentina realized how much meaning her presence already carried. She had been invited to open the event with a talk on professional transformation and identity. When she received the invitation, she hesitated. She still didn't see herself as someone capable of inspiring with speeches, but she accepted. On the day of the event, she wore a simple blazer, tied her hair in a practical style, and the same pair of discreet earrings she had worn since her store days. She took the stage with her heart racing, but she did not read from any prepared text. She simply told her story. She spoke of the humiliations, the doubts, the shame, the fury she felt upon discovering she was part of an experiment, but also of the conscious choice to stay. She spoke of the strength that is built in silence and the courage that is born when one chooses not to run away, even when wounded. The audience fell, silent, and in the end, she was applauded while standing. That same day, when she returned home, she felt a different kind of peace. It wasn't euphoria, nor inflated pride. It was a mature serenity, almost silent. She no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, not even to herself. She had become who she needed to be, not because of Andres, nor the project, nor the company, but because she had decided to go through the process without losing herself. She knew that life would still bring other tests, other voids, other confrontations, but now she carried something that no one could take away, the awareness of who she had become. And even if she still felt out of place in some spaces, she was no longer a prisoner of silence. She was the author of her own story, and that was, finally, the most beautiful part of the entire journey. Months later, during a round table with new participants of the program, now restructured based on everything Valentina had experienced and built, she was invited to share her journey once again. But unlike the previous presentation, this time she spoke with more ease. There was no longer an urgency to justify her path. There was only the desire to show that it is possible to break cycles, even if slowly, even if with fear. She said that she still had difficult days, that she still questioned herself, that she hadn't become a heroine. And perhaps that was what touched the listeners the most, because she didn't speak as someone who had conquered everything, but as someone who continued to choose, day after day, not to return to the place where she was merely invisible. And when the conversation ended, as she rose from her chair, Valentina felt something different, an inner silence. Not that old, heavy silence from when she lived in the shadows, but a silence of peace, of presence. It was as if she had finally closed a cycle. Not because everything was resolved, but because she was no longer a captive of what was not. What began with an isolated gesture of justice became the starting point for a profound, courageous, and real reconstruction. And even if she still carried memories, insecurities, or doubts, she now carried something much greater, the awareness that her story would no longer be written by others. It would forever be written by her. In the following months, Valentina was invited to join new projects within the company, some even outside the talent development area. She became a consultant in internal inclusion processes, guiding leaders on how to see potential where they once only saw a function. Her experience became a reference, but she made sure to remind everyone, whenever she could, that there was no formula. Every person carries a story that no one sees. The role of a leader is not to create models, but to open spaces. That phrase, which she often repeated, ended up being echoed in meetings, written on bulletin boards, and even used in internal campaigns. But for Valentina, more than a professional motto, it was a constant reminder of herself. She never wanted to be a symbol of overcoming. She only wanted to live with dignity, to occupy her space with autonomy, and no longer accept the label of invisible. In a more intimate conversation with a new employee, a shy young woman, newly arrived at the company and clearly uncomfortable with the environment, Valentina saw reflections of her own story. She listened carefully, without haste, and said only what was necessary. You don't need to change who you are. You just need to discover who hasn't yet had a chance to be. That seemed simple, but the young woman cried. Valentina was not surprised. She knew how deeply words could reach when spoken at the right moment. Seeing that, she understood that her strength now lay in provoking awakenings in others, not with grand speeches, but with genuine presence, with truth, with listening. And that, in the end, was more powerful than any position or recognition. It was about continuity, about transforming what once hurt into a bridge for others to cross. One evening, while organizing her notes at home, Valentina found the first note she had received from Andres, that plain white paper, simple, with the signature AC at the end. She had kept it without realizing, hidden among the pages of an old notebook. Holding it again, she felt no bitterness, no anger. She felt clarity. It was there that everything had begun, even if the beginning had been imperfect. She realized that life is made of coincidences, contradictions, mistakes, and restarts, disguised as ruptures. What mattered most was what she did with it. And despite the crooked origin of the opportunity, it was she who decided how to move forward after the door had opened. She didn't need to erase the past to move on. She only needed to remember where she came from, not as a painful memory, but as proof of her own capacity to transform. Before sleeping, she wrote one more line in her reflection notebook. Being seen changed everything, but seeing myself changed even more. She closed the notebook calmly, turned off the light, and lay down with a light body. For the first time, she slept without the burden of feeling the need to prove herself. She knew that the next day would bring challenges, deadlines, meetings, and perhaps even insecurities. But now, she carried something that no one could take away, the awareness of who she had become. And even if she still felt out of place in some spaces, she was no longer a prisoner of silence. She was the author of her own story, and that was, at last, the most beautiful part of the entire journey. Months later, during a conversation circle with new participants of the program, now restructured based on everything Valentina had experienced and built, she was invited to share her journey once again. But unlike the previous presentation, this time she spoke with more lightness. There was no longer an urgency to justify her path. There was only the desire to show that it is possible to break cycles, even if slowly, even if with fear. She said that she still had difficult days, that she still questioned herself, that she hadn't become a heroine. And maybe that was what touched those listening the most. Because she didn't speak as if she had overcome everything, but as someone who continues to choose day after day not to return to the place where she was merely invisible. And when the conversation ended, as she got up from her chair, Valentina felt something different, an inner silence. Not that old, heavy silence from when she used to be dimmed, but a silence of peace, of presence. It was as if she had finally closed a cycle, not because everything was resolved, but because she was no longer a captive of what was not. What began with an isolated act of justice became the starting point for a deep, courageous, and real reconstruction. And even though she still carried memories, insecurities, or doubts, she now carried something much greater, the awareness that her story would no longer be written by others. It would forever be written by her. Shortly after, Valentina was invited to join new projects within the company, some even outside the talent development area. She became a consultant on internal inclusion processes, advising leaders on how to spot potential where before they saw only a function. Her experience became a reference, but she made sure to remind everyone, whenever she could, that there was no formula. Each person carries a story that no one sees. The role of a leader is not to create models, but to open spaces. That phrase, which she frequently said, ended up being repeated in meetings, posted on bulletin boards, and even used in internal campaigns. But for Valentina, more than a professional motto, it was a constant reminder of herself. She never wanted to be a symbol of overcoming. She only wanted to live with dignity, occupy her space with autonomy, and no longer accept the label of invisible. In a more intimate conversation with a new employee, a shy young woman recently arrived at the company and clearly uncomfortable with the environment, Valentina saw reflections of her own story. She listened carefully, without haste, and said only what was necessary. You don't need to change who you are. You just need to discover who hasn't yet had the chance to be. That seemed simple, but the young woman cried. Valentina wasn't surprised. She knew how deeply words could reach when spoken at the right time. Seeing that, she understood that her strength now lay in provoking awakenings in others. Not with grand speeches, but with genuine presence, with truth, with listening. And that, in the end, was more powerful than any title or recognition. It was about continuity, about transforming what once hurt into a bridge for others to cross. One evening, while organizing her notes at home, Valentina found the first note she had received from Andres, that plain white. Paper simple, with the signature AC at the end. She had kept it without realizing, hidden among the pages of an old notebook. Holding it again, she felt neither bitterness nor anger. She felt clarity. It was there that everything had begun, even if the beginning had been imperfect. She realized that life is made up of coincidences, contradictions, mistakes, and restarts disguised as ruptures. What mattered most was what she did with it. And despite the crooked origin of the opportunity, it was she who decided how to walk forward after the door had opened. She didn't need to erase the past to move on. She only needed to remember where she came from, not as a painful memory, but as proof of her own capacity to transform. Before going to sleep, she wrote one more line in her reflection notebook. Being seen changed everything, but seeing myself changed even more. She closed the notebook calmly, turned off the light, and lay down with a light heart. For the first time, she slept, without the burden of feeling the need to prove herself. She knew that the next day would bring challenges, deadlines, meetings, and perhaps even insecurities. But now she carried something that no one could take away, the awareness of who she had become. And even if she still felt out of place in some spaces, she was no longer a prisoner of silence. She was the author of her own story. And that was, finally, the most beautiful part of the entire journey. Months later, during a roundtable discussion with new participants of the program, now restructured based on everything Valentina had experienced and built, she was once again invited to share her journey. But unlike her previous presentation, this time she spoke with greater ease. There was no longer any urgency to justify her path. There was only the desire to show that it is possible to break cycles, even if slowly, even if with fear. She said that she still had difficult days, that she still questioned herself, that she hadn't turned into a heroine. And perhaps that was what resonated most with those who listened, because she didn't speak as if she had conquered everything, but as someone who continues to choose day after day not to return to the place where she was merely invisible. And when the conversation ended, as she rose from her chair, Valentina felt something different, an inner silence. Not that old, heavy silence from when she used to be dimmed, but a silence of peace, of presence. It was as if she had finally closed a cycle, not because everything was resolved, but because she was no longer a captive of what once was. What began with an isolated act of justice became the starting point for a deep, courageous, and real reconstruction. And even though she still carried memories, insecurities, or doubts, she now carried something much greater: the awareness that her story would no longer be written by others. It would forever be written by her. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe, like, share the link, and hit the notification bell to stay updated.